Welcome to Film Showtime. I'm Nes Dangilan, your host. Kamusta po kayong lahat? And how are you, Mr. Kent?
Pretty good.
Alright, tonight, ladies and gentlemen, Film Showtime is very happy to have a repeat appearance from a well-known personality from our community. This young lady is a very active member of the Filipino community at large and continue to be an active member of the community for many years. As a matter of fact, she is now, I've mentioned this before, the president of the Filipino American National Heritage Society, which we'll be talking about that later. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome now Thelma Buchholdt. Hi, Tony. How are you?
Thank you very much, Nes.
Okay. One of the things I forgot to say that not only that you're a lawyer, you're also a member of the Alaska Bar Association.
Well,
right?
That's true. That's
okay.
True.
One of the things that I would like to ask you, Thelma, if you don't mind, you did write a book about Filipino community.
That's right.
That's right. And it is simply titled The Filipino Americans.
No.
Right? It's
no.
culture.
No. Filipinos in Alaska, 1788-1958.
Okay, I'm talking about okay. That we happen to have the book, and I did take a look at some of the things. And in chapter 11 of that book, you wrote about the Alaska pioneers.
Yes.
All right, and went on to say something about the Alaskeros. Now, would you say that those Alaskeros that you mentioned there, that lots of their families are still here in Alaska?
To some extent, yes, but the ones who didn't stay, of course, went back to their respective states like California, Washington State, Oregon, and elsewhere. They didn't stay. Stayed, had their families here, their children, now grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on, and they are still residing in respective states like California, Washington State, Oregon, and elsewhere. They didn't stay, but the ones who in Alaska, some in Anchorage, but many of them are in Southeast Alaska, like Juneau, Ketchikan, and in Bristol Bay, Dillingham area, and of course in Kodiak.
All right, and most of these, if not all of them, are married to the Alaska natives, right?
That's right, because the Alaskeros were mostly men. There were very few women. The Filipino migration to the United States in those days, in the 1900s, 1910, 20, and 30, 40, and so on, were mostly men. So the Alaskeros were male workers of Filipino descent. They work in the canneries.
All right. The reason why I asked you that too is because I asked. I have one colleague that I invited to have dinner with me one time. We had that cafe there more, and I mentioned to him that I'm gonna have him adobo. And when I said that word, he just kind of perked up because he's a native, and he said, "My mother cooked something like that, and he calls it adobo." And I said, "Is your mother Filipino?" He said, "I don't know. I'm going to ask her." Would you believe the next day he told me, "Yep, my mother's father is Filipino," and he never knew it. It's interesting. So there are lots of native Alaskans here that don't really know that they have. Would you say that don't know that they have Filipino bloods on them?
Well, I would say that I think they know. I think they know that their grandfathers or great-grandfathers were Filipinos who were married to a native person, mostly Tlingits. I know that adobo is cooked by many Filipino natives because this is what they learned from their fathers or grandfathers. There's always much talk about not just the pork adobo, or chicken adobo. They make some moose adobo and some walrus adobo. They just modify, the recipe and call it adobo.
And then the name adobo sort of
it's part of the culture. Part of the culture.
Yeah.
They know about adobo. They know about pancit. and some of the Filipino dishes, but adobo is the most common recipe, and you know, many of them eat rice.
Right.
And their fathers or grandfathers introduced rice in their diet, so they ate rice, and many of them even had bagong.
Yes.
The fermented fish.
Right, and this is interesting. You mentioned that in 1903 there's Filipino that came here already.
That's right. Well, the ones who came here in 1903 came on the cable ship Burnside, which was building underwater cable communications between Alaska, mostly Southeast Alaska, and Seattle. And they opened up the communication systems between Alaska and the rest of the world. At the time, of course, you know, we didn't have telephones, and we didn't have, so it was radio, telephone, you know, communications that way. And they worked here for at least a year or so.
And that's documented that there was a Filipino who
Oh yes.
who did this, and what you said, they were divers from the Philippines?
The cable ship Burnside also laid cables, communication cables in the Philippines. So the same workers in the Philippines who were able to dive came here and dive and lay the cables.
Interesting. Now they had to go back to the Philippines, if I'm not mistaken.
They went back. Many of them did stay in Seattle and other parts, but by and large, I think many of them returned to the Philippines.
All right, but historically, probably the first Filipino we did mention that one time ended up in Louisiana, right? And that was mentioned somewhere in your book, I believe.
Well, no, that's a different story.
There was another story.
That's in 1763.
The Manila Men, or whatever you call it.
Yeah, that's a different migration pattern.
Okay.
The ones who came here, the first one was, you know, in 1788, but he didn't stay. He was a sailor. He didn't stay. And by the 1900s, we had a number of people working in the canneries. And they replaced the Chinese labor and the Japanese labor, and then of course the Filipino labor. You have to remember, in history, there were some exclusionary laws preventing the Chinese and the Japanese to migrate to this country. There was a terror that came about, and the law was passed that there would be no more Chinese or Japanese migrating and living in the United States. So we thought Filipinos were the exception to that because we all came up from Asia, but we were not Chinese, we were not Japanese, we were Filipinos, and for the most part, after 1898, we became American nationals. So we were free to come and go in the United States.
That was when Philippines became a territory of the United States?
That's right. The Philippines was acquired by the United States after the Spanish-American War. And if you recall, the United States paid about $20 million to acquire the Philippines and other territories. But basically, that's when we began to come in large numbers to this country, because we never were required visas to enter the country because we were Americans.
Right.
in that sense. But as American nationals, there was so much discrimination in those days that we couldn't own land. And there was even prohibition about interracial marriages between Filipinos and whites. So, but when our people came to Alaska, there were no laws against intermarriages between Filipinos and the Alaska Native. So many of our men intermarried with the Alaska Native population.
All right, and that is so interesting to know. Now, in 1906, that's the first time the Sakadas came to Hawaii. You know, I know
That's
this
right.
is not part of Alaska, but tell us about that.
Well, you know, again, we had the same problem with labor force in Hawaii. Hawaii was a territory. The Japanese and Chinese migration was also part of that exclusionary law. And when the Filipinos began to become popular as part of the labor force, they went to recruit Filipinos to work in the plantation, the pineapple plantation, the sugarcane plantation. So we have the first 15 recruits arrived in Hawaii in 1906. And consequently, today, this year, we are celebrating, we as Filipino Americans are celebrating the arrival of the first major labor force that stayed in this country, which is the Sakadas. And there were 15 of them from Ilocos Sur.
Mostly from Ilocos.
They were Ilocanos, yeah.
All right. And again, ladies and gentlemen, my very special guest is Attorney Thelma Buchholdt, who is the current president of the Filipino American National Historical Society, and also an author who wrote the book entitled Filipinos in Alaska, 1788 to 1958. All right. Thelma, one of the things that I would want to ask you, because you've been around for many years, you've been involved. Besides what you are now, you were a past state house legislator for the Alaska State House, and so many things. And I consider you that you've been around. I'm not saying you're an old.
Well, I'm old.
Like, what I want to know is this: there is currently 15 organizations here in Alaska, and unfortunately, it's not really unusual, and because it happens to other states where Filipino congregates, there is always a divisiveness. Why is that?
Unless, I have to tell you, I'm not a scholar of this kind of topic, but I'll give you my impression. When I think about that, why there are so many diverse organizations, I think only about how diverse it is in the Philippines. We come from diverse culture, society, food, language, and the regions. You either come from the mountain region, or you come from the lowland, you come from a rice growing region, or you come from fish processing region. We come from a diverse group of people, and there is not one unifying factor that would unite ourselves in this country, except for the fact that we all came from the Philippines, which has over 7,000 islands. So with that diverse background, I don't see any reason why, we can be one group. Because I myself, I came from the north, and more specifically, I came from Cagayan, and much more specifically, I have an Ibanag, Igorot, Ilocano background. So by the time
you don't speak Tagalog,
and I don't speak Tagalog, I seem to understand a little bit of it, but I'm not fluent in it. I won't even try. And so you can see, like, my food preference is not the food from around Manila. My food preference is seafood, because I came from the coastal part of the Philippines, and we are all different. It would be so nice if we could unite, but unfortunately, based on those linguistic and food and regional differences, it is very difficult to say we can be one group. I think we can always make an attempt to be united, the fact that we came from the Philippines, but I don't have much hope that we will all be united.
Well, what about the biblical term, the building of the Babel Tower?
Well, yeah, that's probably one of those things.
God came because everybody speaking the same language, and He said, no, it's not going to be this way. So He made everybody speak different language. Now, is that really the problem? Because Philippines is not a homogeneous kind of a country compared to Korea, where they only speak one language, and probably Japan.
I don't know. See, I don't know anything about Korea. I don't know anything about Japan.
They just have one language. Yeah, they have one language, but and probably there are others. It's just
even minor. In this country, Ness.
But America have different language.
We're if we all speak English in this country, but if you went to the South, as I was there last May, I had a hard time trying to understand the English of those people who were talking to me. And I know they were speaking in English, but they are different from the English that I'm familiar with. And I'm sure when they listen to me, they say, you know, she's speaking in English, but something is different about that. So, yeah, but the thing is, the difference though is that in this country, English is spoken in various dialects, you might say, in various intonations. But in the Philippines, we don't speak the same language.
That's right.
Once you land in Manila, you can hear various you outside of the Tagalog region. You go to Bicol, you go to the Visayan Islands, you go to Mindanao, you go to the north, and even in the north, then there will be different languages and different dialects. So I think it has something with linguistic differences and then therefore different temperaments.
Okay, knowing these things, knowing what you all said, do you think that there is possibility that maybe we can unite and agreeable on something?
Oh, sure, we can unite on issues, for instance, education. We can promote education. We can promote appreciation for the diverse cultures of the Philippines among ourselves. We can promote labor projects and just promoting our culture. Those are available. Those are easy to do. But yes, sometimes those things, even if you do those things, there's always someone who thinks she or he knows more than the others. So that's the problem, you know. We are all leaders, it seems like. No one wants to follow. And a lot of times, our temperament is such that if you have an idea and no one believes in your idea or accept your idea, we have a tendency to resent the fact that our idea has not been accepted. We haven't gotten into this democratic society where the majority prevails. You know, when you vote on an issue and the majority wins, the losers usually drop out. And get very upset, and eventually may come back in time or never, and that is not being a good sport. I think, well, somebody's going to criticize me for this, but I think we are not all good sports. As Filipinos, we have not learned to be good sports, you know, and we have not learned how the democratic process is supposed to be.
Well, maybe in time we will learn from this, and maybe our future generation, the kids now that's coming after us, will realize this, that you know, you gotta be sports in anything you do. Now, I want to ask you a question. You did start the Alaska, the Alaska building.
Oh, the Asian Center?
The Asian Alaskan Center. You did start that way back in the 80s. And do you think that with all these organizations that we have, and if you have any idea, that we can build one just for the Filipino Americans maybe? And do you have any suggestion for that?
Well, we tried that in the early 70s.
Okay.
And we were going to get donations from each other, you know, sort of assessing each other by donating and paying for property. You know, we would have our property. Actually, it's a very good idea. The only problem is, after a while, people don't really volunteer to contribute to that sort of thing, and that's my experience in the early 70s. Well, nowadays, where the mortgage is very high and there's no visible source of maintaining the facility, it's good to have a facility if you can just don't pay rent on it, or you just have it, and a lot of people will donate, make donations to do the upkeep. But I would be part of that, I don't think, because it would be very difficult.
It would be very difficult. Yeah. I'll tell you why. For example, in sports alone, Thelma, you are probably aware that there is this basketball tournaments that's happening every year here in our community. And there's about 12 teams you multiply the 12 teams times 10. Okay, because those are the players, including the reserves as well as the active players. That's a lot of people, not to mention the families and the fans and the friends and relatives. And this goes on from Pee-wee to the youth to the young adults, and we are practically supporting the Esplanade Recreation Center.
Which I'm glad, because when I was in the legislature, I appropriated funds to build that building.
Yes.
And that was, of course, some 25 or so years ago, but I'm glad you're using it. The unfortunate part about this is that we can't, even if we had a building, you'd have to have a huge building. Think about the operation and maintenance, the insurance, the upkeep of that building is going to be difficult. Who's going to be doing it? Someone will have to volunteer full-time, because it is most likely that we won't have any money to pay a staff.
Unless it's a self-supporting thing where we pay what, $45 per hour at Esplanade, plus the fee for the referees and the fee to become a team player and sponsor, and they do generate lots of money, this team, but they spend it right away. In other words, they're doing it for building that don't belong to them, and maybe it's an idea. Maybe if they spend it for themselves, we can have our own building. We're not just gonna use it for basketball. We can use it for many things.
Okay, that seems like a good idea. Ines, I encourage you to volunteer to do that project.
Film Showtime set up for me and Juliet. Now, you are, I did mention, again, ladies and gentlemen, my special guest tonight is the president of the Filipino-American National Historical Society, and also an author of the Filipinos in Alaska, year 1788 to 1958, which is no other than attorney Thelma Buchholdt. Now, Thelma, you are going to have a convention pretty soon, which is going to be in Hawaii. Tell us about that.
Well, every 2 years we have a conference. We call it the National Conference, and this year, at the end of June and the first couple of days of July, we'll have it at the Ilikai Hotel in Waikiki Beach. And everyone is invited. Anyone who wants to come is welcome to come. They can check our website. It's there. It's www.fanshs-national.org. It's and if you don't remember all those many words, just put down Fans National, and you'll find the website. And there is a section in that website that tells you about the conference in Hawaii that's coming in 6 months. So I will be going there. I'm hoping that a few Alaskans will go. In fact, I invite you and Juliet to come to the conference. And this will be in preparation of hosting the 2008 conference, which will be in Anchorage. So it should be a great experience to go to Hawaii at that time, meet other historians and authors and people who are really interested in the Filipino-American history. Now, let's remember that the thrust of the Filipino-American National Historical Society is our history in this country, not the history of Filipinos in the Philippines. We are dwelling mostly on the information of Filipinos in America. So that is the thrust of the Historical Society. We have a lot of history that has not been researched and written. Even in Alaska itself, I'm interested in the history of the Filipino-American native, the Filipino fathers and grandfathers, and the Alaskan native mothers.
I know of 5 or 6 Filipino natives here that have approached Film Showtime, and as a matter of fact, they want to visit Philippines so bad that I thought, we can get together. I'll mention to you their names, and maybe we can make a special trip there. You did mention that this FANHS is for the Filipino Americans here in America, which, by the way, you have a clipping or a video that was made by Dorothy and Cordova, the
Yes,
Cordova.
yeah, we have.
Do you still have that?
Yes, I do. I'd be willing to lend it to you, and
Okay,
you can write it in your.
I'll tell you what, we are going to show a segment of that as we speak, and so that the Filipino community will have an idea of what the FANHS is all about.
We call it funds. That's
Funds.
easiest to
Funds,
say
yeah.
than FANH. You know.
Again, Thelma, it is really great honor for the Film Showtime to have you, and especially I'm sure the community have learned a lot from you and all the things that you're doing for the Filipino Americans. Again, thank you very much. Maraming salamat po. And Jus de Agnina, and do you have a parting word to say to our community right now?
Well, I wish everyone a happy new year. Naimbag nga baro nga taon inyo apo amin, dakay amin. How do you say it in Tagalog? Something bagong,
Maligayang
something.
bagong taon.
Oh, okay, whatever it is. All right, and I wish you all a happy 2006. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, ladies and gentlemen, my special guest, the President of the Filipino American National Historical Society, and also the author of Filipinos in Alaska 1788 to 1958, which is no other else than Attorney Thelma Garcia Buchholdt.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you in the next program.